Today's episode is made possible by America's Christian Credit Union, inviting you to bank with purpose and invest in what matters most.
I was continuing to try to make sense of this, in my notes, and I found I had to constantly reread my own notes because my epistemological grooves were so deep that I would come to some kind of halting conclusion where I found, N.T. Wright or Richard Bauckham's account of the historical reliability of the biblical texts, more convincing than I expected to. But if I didn't confront myself with that tentative conclusion repeatedly, I would just sort of slip away from it. Like, oh, I'm not the kind of person who believes this stuff. That's not an argument, but that's sort of the default mode. Now, N.T. Wright's Resurrection and the Son of God is it's a behemoth, and even for me as a fairly scholarly reader, I found it at times overwhelming, and I would have to kind of go back and read the chapter in Tim Keller's Reason for God, where he kind of summarizes Wright's case for the resurrection, so that I could get myself reoriented for the forest instead of the trees. And he argues that coming back from the dead was not something that dead messiahs did in this time, and that there were lots of self-nominated saviors, prophets running around. Certainly, it's not something that Jesus's followers would have expected. And he says that either the empty tomb or Jesus's recorded appearances, if we had one or the other in the documents, they would not have yielded the early Christian belief in the risen Messiah, but that there's reason to take both seriously, and that both in combination, that the tomb was empty and that Jesus did appear to his disciples, they're the only reasonable explanation for this very early, very strong belief in the resurrection. And Wright says that attempts by, he calls them kind of post-Enlightenment scholars, to mythologize these stories and to read them as later Christian beliefs imposed on the past, to say that the witnesses in the Gospels were engaged in wish fulfillment based on dreams, or the special feelings they had about their experience with Jesus, their own guilt, whatever, that all of this is essentially chronological snobbery, to use C.S. Lewis's phrase, and that it doesn't take seriously the quite sophisticated way in which first century Middle Eastern people navigated their world and their worldviews. And reading Wright lay out this argument made me see that I was myself kind of guilty of that condescension toward the past, and I hadn't adequately appreciated the richness of first century Palestinian, Hellenistic milieus, and that if I were to simply accord to that culture the same courtesies I would want for someone studying my world, I had to just take the biblical accounts seriously in a new way. The other thing I was coming to realize is that my resistance to the resurrection was premised on a really deeply seated anti-supernaturalist bias. I was finally becoming aware of my existence in this closed universe. And the more I thought about it, especially as I was doing all this reading on cosmology and becoming persuaded of theism, the more I realized that I wasn't really entitled to those assumptions, and that if I was willing to suspend my disbelief in the supernatural, well, then the Christian account of the resurrection was increasingly becoming more persuasive as an explanation for the evidence we have than the other convoluted stories about a stolen body and later mythologizing and what have you. The other crucial thing that JD helped me see, and this sounds quite obvious when I say it, but it wasn't obvious to me at the time, and this is, I suppose, the character of any epiphany, is that I came to finally see that Christianity is unique among world religions, and that it really stands or falls on whether one thing did or did not happen in history. I mean, if the resurrection happened, then, I think we have grounds for accepting that Christianity is true. And if it didn't, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, then our faith is totally in vain, and we are among those most to be pitied. And that gave me a way of kind of pragmatically narrowing my focus. It freed me from the paralysis I described before, where I felt like I had to investigate all world religions and I had to investigate every set of claims that Christianity makes. That just became overwhelming to think about. But this way of reorienting my seeking helped me see that, well, all those questions are important. Sure, it's not that you close them off, but you can kind of set them aside and focus on this one thing. It gave me a way of putting a pin in all my other questions and setting them into the category of mystery just for now, right? And so that I was able to make progress on this central question in the case of Christianity, especially because it's fundamentally a historical question, and I'm a historian, so I felt qualified. I mean, I'm not a specialist in the first century, and so I'm very aware of my limitations. But in a fundamental way, I understand the methodology. This is not to say that I ever thought or think now that you can prove the resurrection, right? But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we can't get close to that singularity, that we can't learn an awful lot about the immediate context, preceding and also the aftermath of the miracle through application of the historical method. So I found, one of the books I was reading at this time that was so helpful to me is Sheldon Van Auken's memoir of becoming a Christian during his time at Oxford in the 1950s, under the influence of C.S. Lewis, called A Severe Mercy. And he talks about, feeling himself to be standing on this, on one side of this chasm, and there's this gap between him and Jesus. And he's so focused on this gap and how is he going to get across the gap? And then finally it dawns on him to look behind him and see the emerging gap between his own worldview, older worldview, and where he is standing now. And he realizes, oh, I can't just stay where I am. Like, either I have to jump forward to Jesus or I got to jump backward. And actually that chasm is even bigger now. And it involves an active rejection of Jesus and a reaffirmation of this old worldview that I'm not sure is plausible really for me anymore. It's not serviceable. And that changes how achievable, right, that gap in front feels. And that really that helps capture, I think, some of my mindset. I was continuing to hope that I would have some sort of clarifying mystical experience. I thought surely one can't become a Christian just by reading lots of footnotes. And so I was, praying for this, and I was like talking to Christians of various descriptions, what's the emotional side of this? Like, why am I not experiencing any of that? And I had a few conversations with Catholic priests, with Tim Keller, who he was dying of cancer at this time, but that man was an evangelist to his dying breath. And we had a few Zoom calls, where he talked through these things with me. And he said, faith is kind of like a friendship, and it's a relationship with a person. And just as when you're thinking about becoming friends with somebody, yeah, you can ask around about them. You can, Google them, look at their social media accounts, kind of get a sense of their reputation and what they're about. But ultimately, you cannot know what they're like, and you can't know what the friendship is like until you take the risk and enter the relationship. Faith is like that. And, as I was describing what I was hungry for, he and other Christians would say, well, you're describing the experience of faith. And that's the thing that you've got to take the risk to begin to actually have. That seemed plausible to me. So, this is how I got to the point where I had not had any lightning bolt experience. But by the end of this crucial summer, I thought, well, I'm not 99% certain that the resurrection happened, but I am well north of 51%. And if I am a conscientious pragmatist in the spirit of William James, who's actually willing to revise my working theory of the universe based on new evidence, then it seems like the thing I have to do here is submit. And so that's that's what I did. I mean, I went from praying, God, please show yourself to me, which had been my main prayer all summer, to, Jesus, okay, I accept you as Lord and Savior.